I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, as we know, this bill provides for a mixed governance model for ECAN for the local government term 2016 to 2019. But we've already had several years since the commissioners were appointed in 2010, and it's difficult to understand why a further transitional period of another 3 years is now needed. We in New Zealand First think that's far too long before return to a fully elected ECAN. 2019 would mean that we would have had 9 years of appointed commissioners, much too long a period. Mr Speaker, democracy requires a return to a fully elected ECAN next year and not in 2019. Now, I want to say this at the beginning. I supported the appointment of the commissioners to replace the ECAN councillors in 2010 because I think it was true that ECAN was then dysfunctional, that it was making irrational, politically motivated decisions about water management which were in fact threatening the orderly processes for consents for takes and uses of water for irrigation which were then in train. And those processes were then well developed, for example, for the Central Plains scheme. Actions then by ECAN simply undermined those processes. Mr Speaker, there were then and still are 4 problems with ECAN. One was that in 2010 there was a lack of a properly developed strategic plan for fresh water. And in fact, contrary to what Eugenie Sage said, that process was shambolic and wasn't really going anywhere. And nobody really had any confidence that it would. And that, in fact, is the truth of that matter, whether we like it or not. Furthermore, that process was actually used to undermine the consent process for the Central Plains scheme even while it was in train. And for me, I think that was most improper in the way that ECAN behaved at that time. Secondly, ECAN acted far too late, about at least 10 years too late in getting that plan off the ground. So that organisations such as the Central Plains scheme, which wanted to get started, had to do it in a vacuum without any such strategic plan, and that was the fault of ECAN up until 2010. And it's no surprise that that was the case because the third problem with ECAN then was that management then acted like a law unto themselves. They wouldn't listen to people, and neither would the councillors of ECAN listen to people at that time, and I was one of the people who was seeking to be heard and found it very difficult to even get a hearing with management or councillors which was meaningful and constructive. And we had plenty of good things to offer, but they didn't want to know. So management was a major problem. And fourthly, the fourth problem is there is an inherent problem of an urban versus rural schism in Canterbury because of the urban dominance, something that Eugenie Sage doesn't seem to appreciate. It's not appropriate for the city of Christchurch to dominate the whole region in the way she suggests would be appropriate. So therefore the appointment of commissioners in 2010 was in fact necessary. They have in fact done an excellent job. They did listen. They did have an excellent process for the development of the strategic plan, and they took people with them, something which ECAN as an elected body had not done. And they did achieve that plan, and it is now effectively in operation. It's brought order and direction and does properly balance the need for economic development potential of irrigation with sustainable farming practices. And that will lead over time to a better environment. I disagree again with Eugenie Sage, who uses statistics which don't recognise the fact that farming in Canterbury has been going on for more than 100 years, and there's a lot of nasty stuff still in the post. That's got nothing to do with the modern and more effective farming practices in terms of the protection of the environment, which are now in place. Mr Speaker, The truth is that the objectives of the 2010 appointments, however, has been achieved. The commissioners have done a good job, but they're no longer needed. What they were put there to do is done. So a return to democracy next year is essential. It is wrong to treat Canterbury as different to other regions, and Canterbury is entitled to fully democratic local governance. And the proposal for 7 elected and 6 appointed people on ECAN is bizarre. It's likely to create tensions, just in the same way as the old urban-rural schism created tensions. A them and us attitude will develop. It won't be positive for ECAN. And I note, for example, that in clause 11 of the bill, that there are a number of criteria. And when you look at those, management of freshwater skills, local authority governance skills, tikanga Maori skills, and knowledge of the Canterbury region and its people, those are the same things which actually elected people are perfectly capable of judging, and we do not need appointed commissioners for those reasons or because of the need for those skills. And, Mr Speaker, the mixed governance model is likely to result in the government being accused of political interference, and that won't be positive for ECAN either. However, I would have to say this: the provisions to carry forward the limitations on appeal rights are still needed and are acceptable to New Zealand First. They are needed to ensure that the implementation of decisions made already and the furtherance of the strategic management plan are not compromised. Otherwise, everything which has been achieved so far could be lost. Mr Speaker, what is really needed is not the appointment of commissioners for another 3 years, but a genuine review of the structure of regional governance in Canterbury. New Zealand First policy is this: it does not support appointed members for ECAN and will therefore not support this bill. New Zealand First is committed to effective regional democracy with which appointed members are not compatible. Secondly, New Zealand First does not support the resurrection of ECAN as it was prior to the installation of the current commissioners. So just having appointed commissioners for another 3 years and then going back to the old system is not acceptable either. And that is simply because of that urban-rural schism which exists inherently in Canterbury, with a large city which tends to dominate everything else. So, Mr Speaker, we would not support ECAN as it is currently, as it would be reconstructed after 2019. And instead, New Zealand First would support a unitary authority for Christchurch City and would give the rural authorities either the option to have unitary authorities themselves in Huranui, Waimakariri, Selwyn, Ashburton and Waitaki, or they could club together and have a rural regional authority. That is something for them to decide. So, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First acknowledges the historical and inherent problems with ECAN based on the urban-rural schism of interests, but does not accept more appointed commissioners and seeks a longer-term review of regional governments aimed at unitary councils in Canterbury. We see that in the long term as the only solution, and this bill will do nothing at all to solve any of those problems. New Zealand First will therefore be obliged to vote against it.
I call